So welcome everybody this afternoon to the IUME Colloquium series, and we are very, very excited to have our amazing guest here today. I'll say a few things about the IUME Colloquium series. It's a series, a space here at Teachers College, which we feel like a very special space that gives the opportunity for young scholars, young faculty to present their research and be in a space of like-minded researchers, scholars, and community members to really engage in this space of critical scholarship, spaces that we think are very important to not only the university but also the community and the world. So we're very, very honored today to have Dr. Brian Lozenski. IUME also, I will say this is of the Institute of Urban and Minority Education. We have a few other events and things to sign up on your way to get some more information about that as well. So we are very excited to have Dr. Brian Lozenski, an amazing scholar in person. I will give a short introduction of some of the general info, but also have known this man for many years, and he has just been a really awesome presence, really steadfast in his passion and belief, and it's really amazing to have seen him from the University of Minnesota all the way here to Teachers College in New York. So, Dr. Brian D. Lozenski is an assistant professor of urban and multicultural education in the Educational Studies Department at Macalester College in St. Paul University. He received his doctorate from the University of Minnesota, where he studied the cultural context of teaching and learning. His research explores the intersections of critical participatory action research, Africana studies, and cultural relevance in the education of youth of African descent. Dr. Lozenski holds deep commitments to community-engaged research framework where academic researchers follow the lead of community members and organizations to identify prevalent issues that can be addressed through an inquiry-based approach. In this effort, he directs a program where high school youth gain college credit by conducting participatory action research through the lens of African knowledge systems. He co-created this partnership between multiple post-secondary institutions in the Twin Cities and community-based organizations as well. So we're very excited for him to present his research here today, and let's all give it up for Dr. Brian Lozenski.
How's everyone doing today?
Great.
So I want to thank you for hanging out with me today. In particular, I want to send a shout out to the IUME family. Thank Dr. Ernest Burrell for giving me this opportunity to connect with such a powerful group of folks here over the years. And then everyone who kind of put everything together and made me feel comfortable and welcome as a visitor to Teachers College. I definitely want to let you know just how humble I am for this experience. So let's see, when I was thinking about, what do I want to share about the work that I do and what would be of most use to folks who have been kind of at the core and at the foundation of the work that I've been doing, right? So my trajectory, and I know I've shared this experience with Ernest, my trajectory was profoundly influenced when I saw Ernest present with a group of high school researchers at AERA back in like 2009. I was on my way to be, kind of looking at like critical mathematics in education and like, how can we use mathematics to address power? And it marked like a fundamental shift for me in terms of taking a more interdisciplinary approach to the work that I'm doing. And so I think, being able to come full circle and share this is really, this is an amazing experience for me. So that being said, thinking about what I want to talk about today, obviously a lot of the folks in the room, have an understanding of youth participatory action research and kind of like what it is. So I don't think it makes sense for me to actually go into the nuances of YPAR, what we call YPAR. So for me, it's about where's this work in terms of how we're thinking about the directions that it's going, how we're thinking about our approach through an epistemological framework, right? So what is the thinking behind the thinking of YPAR, right? How do we organize knowledge in this work? And that's really what I'm going to focus on today, and I'm going to use the metaphor of jazz to try to do this. So hopefully you all get something out of this, and we can have some dialogue. I'll try not to speak actually too long, because I think if we get more dialogue happening, that'll be better. So I'm going to share. I'm also not going to approach this like just kind of sharing my dissertation work. There's going to be elements of my dissertation work in it, but the program that I helped to create, that Maura mentioned beforehand, is an ongoing program. It's entering its 5th year now, and we've had you know, all the different cohorts of youth researchers doing different work each time around. So I'm going to take bits and pieces and tidbits from different groups, and still kind of get at some of the empirical data from my dissertation. But I wanted to start out with a story, and in our research, and I'll say more about this later on, it's connected to a community-based organization in St. Paul, Minnesota called the Network for the Development of Children of African Descent, which is a family literacy center in St. Paul that approaches, and we approach our work there through an African Center framework. And so that being said, one of the important aspects of the work is intergenerational knowledge sharing. So one of the activities, or one of the things that we always do with our youth researchers, and these are high school youth, and again I'll get into more specifics, but we venture out to meet with community elders. So in one year we went to meet with an elder named Atuma Zahir, who runs the Cultural Wellness Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to just meet with her and share our perspective, or the youth perspective, on how they were approaching their research, and then to get guidance and wisdom from her in terms of our marking forward. So we're in the meeting, and we're kind of having this discussion, and she's kind of, she's doing, dialoguing with the youth, and kind of asking them where they were at with things. And while we were doing this like huge cloud of blackbirds started to crow outside of the window. And the youth kind of turned their attention out the window because it was loud. Like we really weren't expecting it. And the incredible teacher that Elder Atum is, she used that, right, in terms of her conversation, right? So she asked them, like, do you hear the birds, right? Like, what does that make you think about, right? And of course, what do you think they might have said when you see like a huge
Death.
cloud of what? Say it.
Death.
Right, some kind of omen, right? Some kind of like a marker of something that was about to happen, a negative, right? Negative thing that's about to happen. And that's the way the youth responded. They're like, oh, that's an omen, like something really ominous is about to go on. And she said, well, for us, those birds symbolize protection and safety, right? And so that conversation kind of took on a life of itself, right? And so she started to talk about, well, what does symbolism mean, right? What is the symbolism of these birds? And the question became, where did you get that idea that birds represented death? And we talked about, mostly it was in the movies, right? Alfred Hitchcock's, The Birds came up, and the youth had seen that. And some of these other movies, and The Crow, and like all, right? And they mentioned all these films. And then she talked about, well, in her knowledge system, right? In her knowledge system, which she connected more to like a Egyptian knowledge system, or ancient Egyptian, right? So she was talking about how that broke apart, right? How that was a disconnect for them, okay? And so in her point, the point she ended up making was that somebody wrote these ideas down. Somebody imagined these ideas, wrote them down, filmed them, because we were filming our session, right, at the same time, because we always use this to go back to in terms of our own research, right? So she pointed to the camera and said she filmed them and then put it out into the greater consciousness. And now when we see blackbirds, we think about death as opposed to thinking about safety and protection, right? And so for us, that became, I think, a way of looking at what I would call epistemological dissonance, right? So we've got this dissonance that's happening on two sides of colonization, right? A pre-colonization way of thinking about and understanding knowledge and symbolism, and then a post-contact, right? A post-colonial way of thinking about that. And so when we're thinking about critical, right, and critical research, right, research that addresses power dynamics, right, this research comes out of catastrophe, right? This comes out of that contact, that colonial contact. And no matter what those research traditions, if we identify a critical research tradition, we're dealing with, right, we're dealing with that catastrophic notion, right, that people's lives are being impacted in profound and often negative ways. So this manifests in various ways, right? It manifests when critical race theorists might, suggest that race is endemic to the United States and thus permanent, right? That resonates sometimes as a dissonance for people, that racism could be permanent, right, in the United States. It comes across when Marxists, right, if you've read Learning to Labor by Paul Willis, right, says that youth resistance, right, can then go and reify their social class status, right? So we promote youth resistance in one form, but what happens when that youth resistance gets taken up in the system, and then those very youth who are resistant, can't gain the material access that they need, right? That's a dissonance. Okay, it comes across when scholars like Eve Tuck or Sandy Grande, from an indigenous standpoint, suggest that United States democracy is incommensurable with native sovereignty, right? So that us vying for civil rights, right, is actually like a counterproductive project with regard to native sovereignty, right? Again, that's a dissonance, right? These things are kind of rubbing up against each other. And so for us to understand that as critical researchers, when we're called to almost do the impossible sometimes. We're called to make meaning of the often unanswerable. We're called to speak truth to power, to strategize, to win. But often what we have to do is sift through various truths, right? And sometimes those truths can be competing. So this is kind of at the cornerstone of the work that I want to talk about today, is how do we take these dissonances, right, and allow ourselves to see something promising in them, right? Something that we can actually do with them. And so I want to play someone who's been very important and influential in my thinking is Dr. Cornel West. And so I want to play a little clip that from a segment. I'm trying to see it here. Okay, a clip from Dr. West that I think will shed light on something I'm trying to get at here. Sorry, just trying to get the right.
This is where Chekhov begins. This is where the blues starts. This is where jazz starts. You think Charlie Parker's upset because he can't sustain a harmony? He didn't care about the harmony. He's trying to completely ride on the dissonance, ride on the blue notes. Of course, he's got harmony in terms of his interventions here and there. But why start with this obsession with wholeness, and if you can't have it, then you're disappointed and want to have a drink and melancholia and blah, 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 blah. No, you see, the blues, my kind of blues, begins with catastrophe, begins with the angel of history and Benjamin's thesis. You see, it begins with the power's wreckage on one power on another. That's the starting point. The blues is personal catastrophe lyrically expressed. And black people in America and in the modern world, given these vicious legacies of white supremacy, it is how do you generate an elegance of earned self-togetherness so that you have a stick-to-itness in the face of the catastrophic and the calamitous and the horrendous and the scandalous and the monstrous.
So that final question, right, that he poses, right, that we're dealing with the pilage of wreckage, right, as our starting point. And yet, how do we develop this, what I would call like a future optimism, right, a future orientation towards his work, right, that stick-to-itness that he's talking about? That becomes the question that I want young people to engage with, the young researchers that I work with. right? And so in our explorations of dissonance, what I want to talk about today, I want to talk about how dissonance resonates, particularly with the experiences of people of African descent, right, in this country. So these dissonances come up all the time, right? Du Bois's double consciousness, right? He's talking about a dissonance of being seen through the measure, through the eyes of someone else, right? You know, William Watkins talks about the precariousness of black citizenship, the fact that black folks have to go ask the state for protection from the state, right? These are dissonances. And for us to explore that, I'd like to really kind of take a deep dive into this notion. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the notion of desiring discomfort, because we're starting with catastrophe, right? We have to get comfortable with discomfort. And then how do we create discomfort, right? And that's through crisis, right? Generating crisis. And I'll talk more about crisis because it could be seen. I've actually written kind of with competing notions of crisis, saying that crisis is not, so often we call things crises that aren't crises, right? And then on the other side of things, like sometimes we actually want crises because there's like an urgency attached to it. And then what I'm actually going to do is talk about dissonance in terms of intrapersonal inside of ourselves, interpersonal between people, and then epistemological dissonance at a larger level, and try to understand how that's generative in this work. So, the interesting thing with the clip from Dr. West is that he wasn't talking about critical research traditions, right? He was talking about music, right? He was talking about jazz and the blues. And there's this quote from Old Father and West, and it's not Cornell, I don't think it's Cornell West. I'm not sure if it's Cornell West or not, now that I think about it. But it says, jazz requires what might be considered a certain irreverence toward the music as written. This irreverence does not imply a lack of respect for the composer of the music, but a sense of participation with the composer in the creative process. The music serves as an outline for the new event rather than an untouchable and finished creation not to be tampered with. Okay? So for me, when I read that, I think of youth, right? I think of a youth mindset, right? So when I'm working with youth researchers and we talk about traditional research paradigms, right? They almost have an irreverence for that, right? It's like, yeah, we could do that, but we could also do these other things, right? So we could start there, but then we can take it in a whole other direction. And so that's where I see these linkages between jazz and these improvisational aspects of jazz that get connected to youth research and how youth epistemology and youth knowledge systems integrate with jazz as a way of thinking, right? As a way of organizing our thoughts. There was a story a few weeks ago, actually it's probably about a month ago now. One of my students, her name is Sierra, and you see her there. This is at the Allied Media Conference last year. She's directing a workshop on collecting sacred stories from our communities. But she said to me the other day, I'd rather argue with somebody who I agree with than argue with somebody who I don't agree with. And so I was like, what do you mean by that? And so she said, when you argue with people that you agree with, it actually forces you to kind of pinpoint what your argument really is, right? Like you have to dig deeper to figure out why you're saying the things that you're saying. And so for me, this is about finding dissonance, right? Finding the dissonance that you can tap into because it helps you locate yourself in a way that arguing with someone who you don't agree with doesn't allow you to locate yourself in that way. So when I hear jazz music, I hear that playing out. I hear people generally agreeing on something, but then there's dissonance within that, right? And to me, this paints a soundscape of what youth research is. So I'll just let us play out for a little bit. I want you to pay attention to that. So in the music, I hope that you heard, you know, competing voices, right? But that there was always, right, there was that underlying current that started with like a singular voice. And that singular voice could be, you know, a young person with an idea. And I'll show you how that plays out in terms of how sometimes the research gets constructed. But it plays out with an idea, and then someone builds on that idea, and then someone else builds on that idea, right? And then, but that foundation remains solid even though it shifts and turns in certain spaces, right? So that's what I'm trying to get at here. And this notion that I'd rather argue with someone that I agree with matches up very well when we actually look at scientifically why dissonance happens with sound, right? So if you look at sound waves that are dissonant, you see that they have a different period, right? There's a slightly different period where one wave is moving at a different, you know, at a different speed than another wave, and then but they come back to match up at certain points, right? So it's like, how do we create this environment? How do we create an environment where we're operating close to each other, just off from each other, and then we come to match up, and then we depart from each other and come back to match up, right? And so for me, that's where this, you know, kind of this jazz epistemology lies. That's where the work lies. And so part of this work, I think, is about desiring a crisis, right? Desiring a place where what you held, something that you've held in your head, is troubled, right? Something that you've held in your head is off-putting, right? And that you have to define something new. You have to relocate yourself based on new information. And so Kevin Kumashiro suggests that education is not something that involves comfortably repeating what we already learned or affirming what we already know. Rather, education involves learning something that disrupts our common sense view of the world. That crisis that results from unlearning then is a necessary and desirable part of anti-oppressive education. Desiring to learn involves desiring difference and overcoming our resistance to discomfort. So this is, you know, again, like our launching point, and that I don't think we can actually do this work without crisis, right? Without, kind of like creating crisis in how we think. So I'm gonna jump really quickly into some background ideas of the work that I do in Minnesota. But one of the first important pieces here, if I'm calling the youth that I work with jazz researchers, right? The question might be, how do you create a jazz researcher, right? Where do they come from? And so I think about where do jazz musicians come from? How do you create a jazz musician, right? And there's lots of ways to create a jazz musician, right? You might have folks who are classically trained in all of the technical approaches to their instrument, right? They've had, you know, lessons, and they've studied the theory, right? And they're able to express all the methods and all these different kind of ways they go into, right? And then you have other folks who hear something they like and they try it, right? They pick it up, and they experiment with it, and they do things that work, and then they don't do other things that, you know, that don't work. But the fundamental piece that comes down to is whether you're classically trained or whether you're picking it up, is that you, at some point, if you're going to be a jazz artist and a jazz musician, you have to get comfortable with dissonance, right? You have to be able to exist in a space where there's improvisation happening, and improvisation in and of itself creates more dissonance, right? So if we're doing youth research and we're taking an improvisational stance into some of the work, crisis and dissonance is going to come up, right? We're actually creating that environment. So for me, the question is, how do you create that environment? And that gets into this actual question of like, who's allowed to do research, right? And that's a question that we tackle obviously quite a bit here at IUME. And I really like this quote by Torian Fine, right? A methodological stance rooted in the belief that valid knowledge is produced only in collaboration and in action. Participatory action research recognizes that those studied harbor critical social knowledge and must be repositioned as subjects and architects of research, right? So I often tell my students that, right, or and the youth that I work with that they're one of the most studied populations in the country, right? Youth of color, right? And yet they're one of the least heard voices in that body of research, right? And so again, starting with that dissonance, with that crisis, often is our entryway into this. And then one other quote that I really love that actually I think really helps define the work that I'm doing from an instructional level, right, from a pedagogical level, is from Freire. And he says, instead of taking the people here as the object of my research, I must try, on the contrary, to have the people dialogically involved also as subjects, as researchers with me. If I'm interested in knowing the people's ways of thinking and the levels of perception, then people have to think about their thinking and not only be the objects of my thinking. This method of investigation is at the same time a learning process. Thus, in doing research, I'm educating and being educated with the people, right? So that becomes an ideological stance, right, that I take with regard to the work that I do. Now, what does this actually mean, right? I said all this kind of like abstract stuff at this point, and so now it's like, what does it look like on the ground? What does this look like in practice? So about 5 years ago now, 6 years. 6 years ago, I was part of a group that created what's known today as the Uhuru Youth Scholars Program in St. Paul, Minnesota. I already kind of gave you the background, Network for the Development of Children of African Descent, where the program is housed. The Uhuru Youth Scholars Program is a dual credit program, meaning that the students in the program get high school and college credit for taking a course with me that's a hybrid course of Africana Studies and Youth Participatory Action Research. There's two aspects to the Africana Studies piece, right? And again, it dials back to this pre-colonial history and this post-colonial history, and bringing those two histories together. So in the pre-colonial history, we look at what we might call African knowledge systems, and I'll give you an example of what that might look like, and so we can play that out. And in the post-colonial history, we connect to the Black intellectual tradition, right? And so thinking about what are the knowledges that are shared, and then how do they actually rub up against each other to create dissonance becomes an important part of this program. So just to give you a quick example of an African knowledge system, or the system that we use, and I probably should have put a little bit more description on the slide, but so we might look at the Dogon of Mali, right? Who are people that have existed over thousands of years, right? Mali's the home of first organized library systems, and right. So when we look at how the Dogon organized knowledge, right? What were their epistemologies? How did they understand knowledge? There was this actual like cyclical aspect to their knowledge systems. Jiriso it means descriptive knowledge, right? Observable phenomenon, things that we see in the world. Beneso is analytic knowledge, right? We see these things, but how do we analyze them? What do they mean? Boloso is comparative knowledge. What have other folks said about what we're seeing and what in our analysis? And Sodai is active knowledge. Once you have the knowledge, you have to act upon it, right? So this becomes the framework through which the Uhuru Youth Scholars do their action research, right? And it's actually important, the order of it, and again, it's cyclical, right? So it's not about the order necessarily, but I want to point out that Boloso as comparative knowledge, typically in academia, we would put comparative knowledge probably second, right? After, or maybe even first, right? When we identify a problem, we identify something observable, then we run out and do a literature review, right? But what happens when you're not in the literature, right? What happens when your voice is not there, right? And so immediately we're asking youth to run out and read what folks who are not connected to them have to say about them. So we actually pull that back a little bit and have them do some pre-analysis with community mention. That's part of Boloso and Beniso, how they work together, right? And then we actually do go out and read, right? But they have a foundation first before they go out and see what other folks have said about them, right? So let's see how that works. And so I'm gonna quickly, and I'm just gonna share what I might call focal participants or core co-researchers. Again, I said I'm going to pull from different parts of this program, but some of the folks I'm going to identify in the next slides, I want you to know who they are. Specifically, we'll be looking at Will, AJ, and Autumn, and some of the things that they had to say about the work that they're doing. So let me give you an example of how these things play out. So I was invited to a master's level class at the University of Minnesota to give a lecture on youth participatory action research. So what I always do when I get invited to do things like that are like just bring the youth, right, and they can explain what they do. So Autumn, one of the co-researchers, my youth researchers, and I kind of sat down and mapped out a lecture. And so she's, in this example, kind of talking about how the cohort, her year, came up with their research question. All right, and I'll read that. I don't think everyone can see this, but she said, me and this other student, Nathaniel, we were arguing about who we thought was ghetto. Right, this guy walked on the bus. He was African American. He had his pants sagging. He smelled like weed, and he was just he actually kind of frightened me a little bit. And I was like, yo, this dude is ghetto. And Nathaniel was like, no, man, he's not ghetto. He just knows what's up. And me and him had this huge debate about what's ghetto. And he brought it to class, and we had this huge discussion, right? And then I added, right, this conversation that turned into a classroom discussion, right, became a unit of analysis for us. Right? It became, well, what does ghetto mean? How do we understand that? Where does it come from? What is this? How do we learn more about this? How can we understand this more deeply? So taking our own interest in this idea, then taking it out and doing what we call exploratory data analysis, or taking our own idea, but then also going out to those we consider our community and seeing what their interest is and our interest, and how we can merge those two. So out of that question, and out of our exploratory data analysis, our research question emerged, which is what is the impact of media on the representation of black youth as ghetto? And how does the media help create and maintain stereotypes of black youth as ghetto? And this came with our, going out and talking to folks, them asking, well, this idea of like, where does this come from? Like, where does this idea of ghetto even come from? And they're connecting it back to media and saying that it's an aspect that's like driven and pushed by media. And so you might think this is like, this could be, and I thought when I first saw it, like, this is actually like a really petty research question, right? Like who cares who gets labeled ghetto, and like we use that term all the time. But actually their work coming out of it got to some really profound spaces, right? So this is an interview they did with Dr. Derek Ball from Oregon State University. And what Jared Ball suggests, and you've kind of took this up as one of their like major findings through their research, is media impacts everything to a great degree. So first, I think it's important to see there's sort of a political and economic and cultural function to the ghetto itself. In other words, to a society like this, the ghetto is important that it must exist to warehouse poor black and brown people in an urban warehouse like indigenous people have been warehoused in reservations. And their role is important. They still provide cheap labor. They still provide markets to purchase products that are being made. They still serve as locations where so-called salacious and illegal activities can be focused, concentrated, and policed. And these communities provide, speaking of that last point, a great amount of increasingly important resources of prisoners who feed the prison industrial complex that is growing. Not to mention a site of cultural production, right, that can then be appropriated and commodified, right? So there's a lot that was coming out of this, but the point became, if there has to be a ghetto, then there has to be a rationalization of who goes in it, right? And that became like the profound finding for the young people, okay? So that being said, another aspect of this work is thinking about, well, how do we break away from these things? How do we break out of these forms of thinking? And what Bell Hooks would call, how do we create an oppositional worldview, right? A mode of operation in which we're actually and conscious of our identity as a standpoint that, exists not only as a struggle, but also opposes dehumanization as that movement which enables creative, expansive self-actualization. Okay? So the way that this looked on the ground, again, this is me interviewing Will about his experience in our program. And so Will says, well, this class kind of brought back a memory I had. Well, it's actually not a memory. It's something that comes up again and again, but it's just like, what's my history? Where I know where we come from, but like there's no way for the common person to just figure that out. Where exactly did I come from? Where did my ancestors, my family directly come from, and why did this happen? I don't know. I can't think of the other questions right now, but I had a lot of them. And then my response was, it seems like questioning is a lot of what you do. I mean, it seems like that's kind of part of who you are. You ask yourself a lot of questions, so it just kind of fell into that pattern of did it fall in that kind of pattern of questioning for you? And then Will says, yeah. And then another pattern formed where they just got laid to rest. And then it just popped up vaguely. It's like, I don't know, I had that question, but just too many piled up. And then, I don't know, they got blurred mentally, right? And I might argue that they got laid to rest probably during his like formative educational experience. But, so I said, well, so what do you think are the major things that you took away from this class, right? Now that we're kind of getting towards the end of it, he said, I don't know, let me just see, I'm trying to form this. I didn't know that our people had built so much, had invented so much. I didn't know that so much was, I didn't clearly see how so much was being muddled over by these other people's successes. And it seems like there's a social structure that's just ingrained. And that's probably what it is. It seems like it's there. And then all we're doing is building off of that. And it will be really hard to try to grow outside of that, right? And so I said, it's hard to get out the structures. And he says, yeah. Okay? So for me, this represents this intrapersonal dissonance within Will. It's that crisis where he is uncomfortable in something that was previously held, right? But I think it's also important to note that he had a skeptical, he was a skeptic, right? He had been a skeptic. He had questions. He's a questioner, right? But then saying that got laid to rest, but now it's being kind of like reinvigorated, right? And so that aspect of it becomes important. So now I want to move on and quickly talk about interpersonal crisis and how interpersonal crisis, again, can become generative. So I'm going to go back to the story of Autumn. And so in the research that they were doing on this conception of ghetto, they were wanting to interview their peers, right? But they were saying, well, we should interview the folks who get labeled ghetto the most. So Autumn was kind of describing that. And AJ said, well, hold up. What you just described is just like me. So like, what are you calling me? Right? So for us, that led to a new research question. Right? This is the improvisational aspect of this. It became, well, what's my lens to viewing the world and how is it formed? Right? How did I get that conception of ghetto in my head? Right? And so this interpersonal dissonance, I think, is important to understand because the interpersonal dissonance creates something anew, right? And for us, it became a new research question. It actually became a more profound research question that was very much tied to the blackbirds and to Elder Atum's suggestion that we come to understand why we thought of blackbirds as death, right? As opposed to like protecting and safety. So in this quest then, to answer this new research question, a whole other set of dissonances emerged. And that's what I want to get to, which were what I would say like our macro or these epistemological dissonances. So for us at NICAD, African ways of thinking are generally our units of analysis, right? So we're thinking about like, where did these ways of thinking come from? So part of what we had to do then was to help the youth understand, well, what are these different ways of thinking and where did they emerge from, right? How do we start with Dogon knowledge systems and end up at African-centered education, right? Where did that come from, right? And what are the overlaps, but yet what are the disconnects? So we might think about African-centered education as it's a form of reclamation, right? It's trying to reclaim, right? Whether we would consider it severed knowledges or knowledges that have been lost to colonization, right? And so we can talk a lot more, and we might, this I think in particular, we might want to talk about the slide as I'm finished, which will be shortly. But what does it mean when we say we're trying to reclaim a traditionalist stance on how African people and peoples of African descent, because again, we're dealing in multiplicities, right? There's no like singular African way of thought, right? But what does it mean when we actually try to reclaim certain things, particularly from a traditionalist stance? And how do those traditionalist stances line up then with, for instance, things like patriarchy, right? So you see, for instance, like a dissonance between black feminism and African-centered ways of thinking. So for us, we had to look at both of those, right? We had to try to understand, why did black feminism have to grow out of, right, these different epistemologies? Because, you know, there was a dissonance. Someone was saying, we generally agree on this liberatory pattern, but, right, I don't see myself represented here. I'm still feeling oppressed in these certain ways, right? And not that there's necessarily a linear progressive expansion out of these, but they do talk to each other, right, and cycle back through, right? So there's probably way more overlap than there is disconnection. But in order to self-locate, right, which became the focus of their research, in order to self-locate, we had to understand these dissonances, right? So that's, you know, this is kind of like the major emphasis of what I'm trying to get at today. I'm gonna wrap it up with one more quote from Cornel West, and this is my youth leading a workshop at the Free Minds, Free People conference in Oakland last year about power mapping their community. And so West says, I use the term jazz for a mode of being in the world. It's an improvisational mode of protean, fluid, and flexible dispositions toward reality, suspicious of either-or viewpoints, dogmatic pronouncements, and supremacist ideologies. To be a jazz freedom fighter is to attempt to galvanize and energize a world-weary people into forms of organization with accountable leadership that promotes critical exchange and broad reflection. And I really love that quote, because naming jazz freedom fighters to me is a similar thing to naming jazz researchers, right? The jazz researchers take up this notion of not subscribing to things that are too simplistic, right? And really having to get down to the depths of what we're actually thinking and where that thought comes from. So I want to end it there. And I think the last thing I really want to say is that jazz researchers is something that I kind of like singularly came up with to describe the young people I work with. They would probably call themselves like hip-hop researchers. And I think all of these like kind of parallels that I made between jazz could very easily be made through hip-hop as well. And so there's this like interesting merging of these things as a way of thinking. So I wanted just to really like concentrate on what does it mean to consider jazz or hip-hop as its own epistemology, right? What are those ways of thinking? And they blend really well together. So I'll stop there. But and I want to have like dialogue, obviously, and like get some of your thoughts on these things. But thank you.
Of the town to your phones and your friends. So push it on.
Yeah, let's have some questions, or we have some time here.
brand new.
Yeah,
My own
Christine.
points for myself. I'm curious as to how you perceive post-colonial theory as something that's actually post or something that's still ongoing.
Sure. And so when I think about post-colonial theory, it's not, I don't think post-colonial theorists would suggest that there's still like not colonization happening. It's that we're dealing with the ramifications of colonization. And right, so post-colonial theory, I think, does the work of centering colonization in some really interesting ways. And I think the post is a weird, because we're not post-colonial anything. We're very much like still dealing with like the impact of colonization, which then I think also is what fundamentally allows it to be in the body of field of like African epistemologies, particularly thinking of like Frantz Fanon or some of the early post-colonial theorists. Yeah.
Well done.
Thanks.
As a lover of jazz, I really get it. I think it's awesome. But I do have a question about just improv. And, you know, a jazz set can go on all night long. This line of research, the way the kids were going, can go all year long, right? Where do you put your bookends? Where, you know, given that we have, you know, you're working with school schedules and student schedules and university schedules, where do you put your bookends in terms of when do I stop? How do I curtail? And I understand the learning is a journey, but
yeah, that's a great question because I don't know if I've still been able to find that answer. Inevitably, we're always really getting to the juicy stuff like as the semester's winding down, right? And it's like, and so what I've tried to do, I've tried to definitely make myself available as things, as you, because a lot of times they'll just come back in the summertime and want to do things, and not everybody, right? A lot of folks are, like they're like, okay, I'm treated like a class. When the semester's over, right? Even though, they got some interesting things out of it. Things like going to present at conferences and provide additional outlets, but at the same time, even preparing for those kind of limits the research, I think, in the sense of like, we have new questions and we want to go back out. So it's a question I still am grappling with, honestly. And I don't know if other folks have like better ideas about that, like how do you wrap up this research and I mean, not wrap it up, but bookend it or something.
The thing I just thought of even is just even a comparison to how do I'm thinking of like arts or production companies. I think of like a dance company. They work on a piece for a really long time towards the production at the end, which connects to something I always wonder. I think about YPAR is especially just because in many of the presentations, I think especially with your kids and a lot of the young people that you work with, and Jamila here as well, is that there's always, I don't know if it's organic or if you can talk a little bit about the ways in the presentation, like they always have poems or rap or songs or some sort of artistic presentation, and just if that is really has been an intentional step in terms of like the way when you come together, or if that comes in another way. I always wonder.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it lends itself really well to like youth culture, to the ways in which young people want to express themselves through the arts. But I think for us, and particularly at Network for the Development of Children of African Descent, it's about like this anti-disciplining, right? Like that there's science, there's the arts, there's the humanities, right? Like it's more about merging these aspects together and trying to really figure out like what is the science of art, right? Or like as art as a science in and of itself. And then to have them think about that and what that actually means and how that changes the conversation with things like STEM, right? If art actually, you know, has science embedded in it. So that I think that's like a really important piece.
Have you also attempted to compare and contrast like different Latino, Asian, and Middle Eastern, like indigenous epistemologies?
Yep, definitely. So that's actually a project that I'm working on right now. Is that I have the Hoover Youth Scholars Program, and we're in an 8-month grant that connects to youth from a Spanish heritage program in Minneapolis, and that uses kind of like Raza studies and Chicano Latino studies as their own framework. So we're coming with, we do ours from like Africana studies. They're doing theirs from, you know, from like Latin studies, or when we get, you know, all the ways that we might name that.
It's called Spanish heritage.
So it's a Spanish as a heritage language, right? So looking at the heritage aspects of youth who are Spanish speakers, right? So it's I'm not explaining it very well.
Because Spain is the colonizer, so that's why I'm like, what?
Sure. But there's like a duality in Spanish language because it's a colonizing language, and yet it's a language also like of marginalized in all its varieties, right? But yeah, and then it's still like there's like indigenous languages that are spoken in, you know, what would be like colonized Spanish spaces too.
Like Philippines, Tagalog.
Or I'm thinking even in Mexico,
Okay.
and right, and in Central America, right? Like, what were the indigenous languages that were spoken there, right? So, the idea is that like youth who are studying those epistemological frameworks, coming together with my youth who are studying these like African epistemological frameworks, connected with yet and still youth from McAllister College who have had experiences with like Asian American studies and these other. You know, so it's really a merging of like various ethnic studies programs, but our question becomes like how do we make sense of these various ethnic studies paradigms when they come in contact, and what are the overlaps, what are the disconnections, and all these different kind of things. So what are the dissonances within those frameworks? We talk more about the program.
So considering the resistance of ethnic studies in Arizona, have you met any resistance of doing like this kind of programming?
Yeah, I think the resistance comes through the unspoken, right? Does this align to these state standards, right? Does this play out in increased test scores? Does this play out in, right? Like all those mechanisms, and you know, honestly, we haven't measured those things. And not that, and there are people actually measuring those things, and I think they should be measured, because actually I think, and we've probably found out that this work actually increases all those other quantitative measurements of what we might call learning. But for me, like it's beyond the scope and capacity of what I'm trying to do right now. But yet and still that becomes the resistance, right? Like that becomes, if you're not doing this, we're not going to fund your program. Or if you're not, if you haven't, if you haven't shown these various things, and we're like, well, how we show these things? We haven't really started yet, right? Like we're, and the other thing is like I come from a community where, and this is some of the writing that I've been doing, which is like, what are our own methodologies, right? What are our own, we're not non-academic, right? We've been academic, right? And so like, we just measure our people by a different standard, right? We measure by a different set of metrics. So what are our metrics? How do we use our own metrics to develop? These are self-determining models. So I'm not really, where I would love some major funding from like whatever XYZ institution or company. I don't necessarily want to use their metrics. But that's a resistance, and it also kind of like leaves us scrambling sometimes. Well, definitely, yeah, thank you all for coming out. Like my email, you see it down there. If anybody has any questions or wants to follow up, just shoot me out an email. I'm working on trying to put together like a book proposal for this jazz researchers kind of concept, and so yeah, and again, like thanks for all the IUME folks for like everything, and just being so welcoming and open and everything. So appreciate y'all.
Thank you, Brian.